Good evening, everybody. We were waiting for the thumbs up. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. It's a really great turnout. I'm Carl Dobman. I'm the Dean of the College of Architecture and Design. And I think what we'll do tonight is we want to celebrate the work that we see. The work is, or maybe the conception of this exhibition and panel started in July, and there was a discussion about all of the different things that we're doing as a college and a university, and even the space that we're sitting in at the DCDT, but the role that Detroit plays in the way that we're thinking about the work that we're doing. And so I think you'll see from us many different ways that we're gonna try and share the work, this being the first of those, and hoping, or the intention is that there'll be a subsequent publication of this work as well. So I think what we'll do is the panelists and I have been spending the last hour or so looking at the work. It felt almost like a jury for a competition in the way that we were dissecting the projects and talking about the projects. But I think what we'll do is we'll take a few minutes and introduce ourselves, and then we have a couple of themes as a way to talk about some of these, talk about the difference, the different projects that we have, and then we'll have some time for questions as well. So why don't we just go down the row.
Sure. Hi, I'm Cezanne Charles, and I'm Director of Creative Industries at Creative Mini Michigan. We're headquartered in Detroit, based out of Tech Town, but we also have offices in Lansing and Grand Rapids, and I am also co-founder of Root of Two, a hybrid design studio.
I'm Justin Mast, the Managing Director of M1DTW. We're a design firm here in Detroit. We started doing mostly architectural and graphic design work, but over the last few years that's sort of blossomed into a lot of other things. So we're a multidisciplinary design firm.
And I'm Lillian Crum. I'm an assistant professor of graphic design at Lawrence Tech University, and also a partner of Unsold Studio, which is a collaborative design studio that does work for creative culture.
Well, I should also, and hopefully everyone has had a chance to look at the work. I did want to thank Chris, Amar, Kate, Georgie, Trent. I think even Lillian was here hanging work earlier today. No? All right. But what we see, the call went out to the faculty, the students, and alumni. And it was just a very open call for work that in some way engages Detroit. Nothing more specific than that. And so some of the conversations that we had as we were looking at the work is maybe what we see and maybe what we don't see, or we were curious about maybe self-selection of work that was happening. And we imagined, when you put out a call like this, you imagine all sorts of different things to happen. And we were kind of waiting and seeing what we would get. And so there's some things that we see here. The hope is that we continue to do this in the future, and I think that work could evolve if we take this on as a yearly endeavor. But maybe I want to let the panelists talk maybe about what we see and what we don't see.
Sure, I can go first. Yeah, I think, like Carl said, we were walking around for a little while trying to find strands, and I think for a while we'd look at a project, come up with a strand, and then the next project would sort of throw that strand off. When we sort of stepped back even more and started to think about, okay, this is an exhibition about Detroit. How are we as designers seeing what design means in Detroit just by what's here? So you see a lot of commentary on public space, urban design. As a design community, we're obviously very interested in land use. I think is something that's big right now. But we also started to question: are there things that are missing? Are there things that were maybe unnecessarily self-selected from the show? There's not a lot of car design, for example, or parts that go on cars, or interaction design. Are these things that we think are not Detroit? I mean, because Lawrence Tech dives into some of these things. Are these things that we think are not Detroit anymore for some reason?
Yeah, and to build off of that being graphic design faculty, we noticed that there is not a whole lot of graphic design work. I know that I have a graphic design 1 student, Brendan, here, who does have work in the exhibition, and the graphic design work that is here is mostly ephemera that relates to bringing people together for Detroit events, but we're not seeing a whole lot more. And one of the questions that arose through that conversation was whether there is self-selection out of the show because the work is not necessarily addressing some of these prevalent conversations about Detroit. And I think that, that's not a criticism, but it's important to be cognizant of what we think is work that's being produced that engages Detroit or not. So just because it's something that isn't related to some of these prevalent conversations that we discuss amongst ourselves or that we hear on NPR does not mean that it's not engaging with the city.
Yeah, and I think I kind of come to that from the point of view of have we over-incentivized a certain type of design in the city? So there are obvious kind of referential materials around planning and design kind of in the city out there that you can either see from the city or you can see from private entities or philanthropy. But what you don't sort of have, I guess, is that person who's standing up for commissioning really amazing interaction design for the city. We do have a city chief technology officer who's actually really beginning to think about, like, what would it be to talk about the network city, right? But we haven't really lived with those kind of proposals coming from maybe leadership outside of the university, and so maybe in some ways we're not seeing that being incentivized in the same way and therefore not represented in the exhibition.
I guess we jokingly were talking about if we had the chance with Lillian that does have some work in the show, but could you just be from Detroit? Would that be enough to put your work in there? And I know that we do studios that are in Flint, for instance, but you live in Detroit and you might be taking a kind of Detroit mindset to Flint. And so for us, there was not a really tight framing in a way that would say that certain work wouldn't be valid to be part of this discussion. I think part of the other thing that we started talking about, well, Justin said it most recently as we were looking at the work, a kind of weight that seems to come with the work. Or we talked about, we never used the word pragmatism, but a kind of seriousness about the work. All the work seems to be of Detroit. And so we started having a conversation about what that might mean. What does that look like? So maybe I'll prompt you guys to pick up on that conversation.
Well, I kind of asked the question around, like, where's the whimsy? We have a couple, like, obvious pieces that really try and use humor in a subversive way, whether it be kind of drawing on elements of, a graphic novel, to thinking about Steve's work, to thinking about even the almost very childlike kind of graphic quality of how we're proposing land use. So there are a few touch points, but almost all of it seems to really be not engaging in spectacle or strange making in some way. Like, it's not just purposeless whimsy.
And I think that's an observation more than a critique. I think it's risky to strange make in Detroit. I think we've seen that go wrong and people get blasted for that. And the things that make doing work in Detroit heavy are real things. There is a lot of complexity. There are a lot of important things to embrace. And I think probably most of us in this room are working to find ways to work with that and deal with that. And I think maybe that's where there's also this longing that comes to just shed that every once in a while and screw around a little bit. So whimsy is probably a better way to put that.
I like that way too.
Yeah, and I might push back a little bit about the comment about whimsy, because I do see it present in some of the work, some of the speculative work especially, that a couple pieces on that back wall that we've revisited a few times. But I do think that there's truth to this observation that there is an overall sense of heaviness in the work.
Or whether that's a seriousness that comes with it. I think we also see a range of work from studio projects and different approaches within that studio work, some which are working with a community, and so maybe that there's an approach to that that then leads to a certain type of outcome, and then maybe more of a speculative approach with some of that. So we also talked about maybe the representation or lack of representation of people in the work. Is that related?
Well, I wonder, because we had this ongoing conversation about if you didn't know the projects or the backstory behind the projects or their genesis, or whether they were alumni or faculty or student work, could you identify what type of outreach or engagement, if any, was involved? And I sort of, as a real outsider, because I had no kind of knowledge of how to read these as alumni or faculty or otherwise, I really struggled to sort of feel like I could pinpoint what type of engagement was at play. But I also didn't mind that, because I felt like a lot of them attempted to be really grounded or have a certain gravity, and maybe that's like not the same as weight, but it attempted to approach whatever it was doing with a kind of rigor. And I think you could feel the rigor in the work, regardless of like how it was generated.
And being part of the faculty here, I think probably have a better sense. I have that insight of how some of these projects were created, but we were talking about whether we would, be able to determine how things were created and that level of engagement. And I think overall we came to the conclusion that nothing here was created in a bubble. I mean, that's really obvious with all of the work, and that there's different levels of engagement with the work, whether it's more observational, maybe there's some pieces that start to talk about co-creation. We can maybe see some evidence there.
And maybe that was another theme for us, a kind of range of, we've been talking about outreach, and I think we started to come up with either a spectrum of outreach that might exist for that. So how do you guys see how that might play out? And actually maybe even a larger or broader prompt for the discussion was, if the work is student work that we see in the show, and much of it is, how would students maybe imagine that next phase of the work? How could this work move out into Detroit and become a real project? How do you take, the legend of taking your thesis project and actually having it built? So how do we imagine this work launching itself out into the city from the studio or from what we see here? These guys were so talkative about an hour ago, I promise.
I'm being like super thoughtful now. Well, so the obvious point that we talked about is this idea that somehow all of this forms an annual review that in some way, shape, or form is a vision put forward of how LTU is thinking about engagement broadly in the city. So I think that that's one really obvious way that you sort of think about making an intervention into the city's thought space, right, in something that's a book form. But then there are a number of projects that really do feel like they are born of kind of existing programs in the city. So whether you're thinking about some of them that could easily sort of be related to what Detroit Future City is doing with its kind of pocket guide to vacant lots. Or you're thinking about kind of the way that some of them very directly deal with neighborhoods, and so are in dialogue with some of the things that like the Kresge Innovation Project is attempting to do. Or even when you're thinking about some of the things that could really dovetail to our issues around kind of reclaiming structures and what we do when the Blight Task Force finally gets rolling again, right? Do we simply keep doing what we were doing, or do we sort of think again about reclaiming, and if we were scaling up the reclamation effort, what does it have to look like? So those are all like really live, viable things that are happening right now. And so these projects feel very related to that.
And maybe in some ways, Cezanne has a lot of experience with foundations, and so she's speaking a little bit to that. Justin, in that same conversation, was talking about neighborhoods. So maybe expand on that.
Yeah, I think that's a good lead up. I mean, I think it's okay to borrow engagement work from other people. Cezanne, for example, does a lot of high-level and there are many organizations that do a lot of high-level planning, engagement, outreach, collaboration. I think it's, one thing's for sure, no matter what you're doing, especially if it's in planning and architecture, you now have to be aware of engagement, and I think we all have to sort of nuance the language we use around engagement to just be able to say what we mean a little bit more. But I think when we're borrowing it, there's still a strategy for kind of revisiting the engagement work or the research work that pertains to your project and sort of finding holes or poking holes in what's passed along. I think Detroit Future City is a great example. Broad vision, citywide. Some 100 million people were interviewed personally or something crazy like that. But because it's broad, when it comes down to a specific building or location, I think there's a lot of room to pick it apart a little bit more.
And ultimately, just to simply state, the work wouldn't be realized without leaving your workspace and without talking to other people. I think that those are two crucial things.
And we also talked about, well, I think there's some broad topics. What is design in the context of what we see here, but also what are the roles that designers might play? That part of the discussion was that it's not just enough to design these things or work in the studio, but there may be an educational component. There may be a neighborhood engagement aspect to that. There are other types of work that seems to grow out of the work that we see on the walls.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, it's a really interesting time, I think, for Detroit to be thinking about how design is utilized to really grapple with a number of issues in the city. But I say that with some pause, because as designers, quite often we're not trained in all of the domains that we now find ourselves in, right? So if we want to, we have the possibility to frame our practice as community and economic development. If we want to, we can frame our practice as neighborhood stabilization. But when we go into those domains, I wonder if we actually possess all of the tools and capacities that we should in order to carry them off. And so it gives me a little pause, and I think that the thing that I find that's very interesting about this work is it doesn't sort of attempt to own all of that territory. It sort of really makes a defense of the designer doing their part in that territory with partners and others.
And maybe I think there's outreach that exists in the context of education. This is something that, at least as a student, I had very little of. And it sounds that where we're kind of going with education is an opportunity for students to engage reality, engage the real world with the notion of theory and practice with Lawrence Tech. That really starts to speed up that relationship and allows our students to think about what they're going to be doing and how they do it. And maybe a moment, just picking up on what Cezanne said, we are developing an MFA in social practice. This is something that Steve Coy has been championing. And so that could be one area where we see, if that's not present or we don't see some of those skills currently present in the work, we may see that in the future.
Yeah.
The other thing to maybe pick up on is, for me, a really exciting opportunity with the work in the range of disciplines that we have within the college. And so we see everything from photography to unbuilding of buildings, urban speculation, all sorts of things. And in the way that we conceived of the exhibit, that these strips or these bands of projects sit next to one another. So as we were walking around, we were trying to think of those adjacencies and started to think, are there opportunities for us to pick up on those adjacencies and imagine, what might exist maybe between those projects? So could you guys talk about that? Lillian?
There's a lot of opportunity for that, and we were just looking at the photography work at the back because that's where we were standing when we started to have that conversation, so I'm trying to recall what prompted that. But I think that initially, the snap reaction was that the work looked really different, but ultimately it wasn't. And so I think that there's a lot to learn from the different disciplines in that sense.
Do you want to? Okay. So the thing that I kind of picked up on was this idea that there wasn't the kind of traditional photograph of like, and now here's this about Detroit, right? Like there's nothing that really makes you sort of feel like we're gonna try and sum it up in one snapshot. And I appreciated the idea that people were okay with ambiguity and complexity. And so there isn't this kind of pretension to a grand narrative in any of the projects. And I found that refreshing.
And any of the projects.
Yeah.
There was a photographic piece or something
Yeah.
different. There was no overarching statement or
Yeah.
conclusion with the work.
Yeah, but better and maybe more interesting questions, and an attempt at problem definition, spending more time in that space than in just kind of like, let's rush towards resolution.
Well, I was going to break the silence. I think that row of photographs across the top there speaks to exactly what you were talking about. They're photographs, but it's architecture and it's social commentary and it's there's a sense of compression that is specific to the spaces that you have. So there's a real human, there's human embeddedness, that's a real word, in those images that bring scale and texture, well, everything that we just kind of were fishing for earlier in this question. Maybe it's because that's what I've been staring at for the past 15 minutes, 20 minutes. But it's remarkable, this one photograph in the center with the modernist edge to it, where the eye in the sky is subverting the system, is part of the system, but then the one over your left shoulder, Carl, where it's this, maybe it's, I don't know which building it is, or it does not belong there, but it's still functioning.
And I think I know who created this work, but I'm going to pretend for a minute that I don't know. And it could be someone from any discipline in the college, right? It's not someone who necessarily took photography. It could be somebody that was doing photographic research in a different discipline. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there for that type of cross-disciplinary research and creative production.
And I think the other thing that we talked about was the fact that really there are only 2 projects that even somewhat obviously attempt to deal with security and surveillance, and that in and of itself and in the show meant that was a shift away from kind of some of the expected norms about how you would talk about the city and the city's kind of surveillance or policing. And there's really only this work, and then there's you can't see the megaphone behind Lillian, but there's one other work that seems to be implying some sort of security and safety kind of issues. So it no longer feels like we're talking about defensible space in some way, shape, or form when we talk about the city. We're talking about something that's more open.
And the call was a really open call. And so part of what we were also trying to sort through was there is a lot of architecture, there is a lot of urban design, and that we have to assume that's because it's tied to a place. And when we say discussion Detroit, that seems to imply a place. But what's amazing about the rest of the work is that the photographs do have, as Steve pointed out, a kind of architectural quality to them. Even when I look at the top of the stairs, the graphic design says walls on it. And so while we wanted to expand the discussion beyond simply architecture and design, it does feel, even in the non-architectural work, it does still feel very present. So maybe I think we also have an opportunity as we talk about outreach, and that's really what the show is about, is trying to share this work that happens in Detroit. I want to get Lillian to talk a little bit about what she's going to be doing next semester. and how we're thinking about this in an upcoming studio program project.
Yeah, so we're in the development of creating a student-run but faculty-led design studio or firm. And so it'd be it'd be rooted in the College of Architecture and Design, but it would also work with students from other colleges, for example, the College of Management, to create a team of students that would be engaging with real clients and doing real world projects. So they'd be offering their design services for real clients. And the idea is that, you know, it's really rooted in that idea of theory and practice, that Lawrence Tech's motto. So students would be applying their knowledge and leading these real world projects. So we're in the process right now of developing a team of students, a very small team of students that would be developing the foundation for the studio through this pilot program next semester, and then it would launch officially in the fall as a class. So students would be receiving academic credit for this. So this is tied to DCDT and a lot of the initiatives that are happening right here in Detroit.
And sponsored by the Hudson Weber Foundation, which includes an incubator and other opportunities both for engagement and for work that will happen within this building. You want to take questions from them?
Sure.
Actually, I was curious, how many people that are here have work in the show?
Oh, good.
Great. So we'd be happy to take some questions from the audience.
So when I first arrived in Detroit, which has been about 9 years ago, I had this like immediate urge as a designer to do something about, you know, Detroit, and then then immediately realized how flawed that was. And then as I started to teach, one of the things that I saw happening at Lawrence Tech with Dr. Kim's work and others was that I observed that I didn't feel like there was this notion that they were designing to fix anything. And the only way I can describe it is tending to the issues within the city. And so one of the things that I struggle with still with Detroit when I do design work is not to be in that mode of, okay, I'm going to fix something that's wrong with the city. The city is what it is, and I'm not here to fix that. Now, I've posed that to people outside of Detroit, colleagues, that have then turned to me and said, well, this has always happened. You know, there's always been a situation where people have come in and they've had new visions and they've changed places. So, you know, I guess I would like to hear what the panel thinks about, like, I mean, I even had somebody call it like colonialism and all these other crazy things. So just tending versus fixing, I guess, is the prompt.
And you're specifically speaking to fixing versus, were you also making a comment about work not being too overly situated in Detroit?
Yeah, overly situated, or even when somebody comes in from the outside, they see something that they see as substandard, and they're going to fix it through an active design, right? Without full knowledge and full engagement from the city. But when I use the word tending, what I mean are some of the projects on the wall here, I'm not sure that they're real proposals, are really just studying the issue and communicating that issue with the public in a slower progression to a better understanding of the built environment. That's the way I see it, as opposed to, okay, here's the rollout plans, this is what we're going to do to fix things, which I think is futile.
Yeah, we spent some time talking about that. I think I agree with you. I mean, yeah, I think the thing that can be exciting is when the work can be broader than Detroit in some ways and can reach outside of the city. When it's somehow situated in things that are abundant here, or particularly resources that we may have in Detroit that allow us to do things that can't be done or not as easily done in other places, but without it being about problem fixing all the time. So yeah, I think a lot of the work here does that too, and which is why we were talking about that. Yeah.
Well, I think these are not local problems, they're global problems, and Jim, what we did in Paris is there. And those photographs across the top could be Beijing, and those black and white photographs behind you could be Paris. And so, as long as we recognize that it's not a personal issue, and that we're all humans trying to correct measures and get things straighter and better, because I think the better off we will be as academics or as students or as human beings.
So I guess my take on this, and this isn't necessarily related to the projects here, but I too, when I kind of came and started working about 8 years ago in the city, was quickly disabused of any notion of fixing anything. And that was actually weirdly a relief, because I'd always been in other cities that were deindustrialized who really felt like they had a mandate citywide to fix it. And so it was kind of refreshing for people to say, you have to first kind of deal with what's here and kind of understand with what's here. And I think over time what I've realized is problem identification and problem framing and problem definition will lead you to the answer. So for instance, the fact that the city up until 2 years ago couldn't send attachments to one another because they weren't working on the same operating system. You can and should fix that. But some problems are more nuanced and more wicked, and therefore we should set aside the idea of rushing to solutions and actually spend some time in really trying to figure out, like, what are the potential intended and unintended consequences of our actions. And so I sort of now am operating in a kind of make, do, and mend kind of fashion, which is a kind of old-fashioned way of saying sometimes you do have to just muscle up and fix things, and then other times you really have to take the time to understand the system impacts.
Yeah, and I think what you're talking about is informed problem solving versus solving a problem that's based on an assumption.
Yeah, for sure.
And to pick up on Steve's point a little bit too, the work, as we were talking about it, it's clearly emerges from Detroit, but it could be lessons that are learned here can certainly be deployed in other places. And we found a really nice, sense to the work that was both of the place, but could also, didn't feel like it could only exist in this place. And so I think there was a really nice feeling about that, as we looked at it and as we saw different things. Another question from the audience?
When we set out to, I'll just talk about it.
Well, we're also simulcasting globally
okay.
right now, so for our online audience.
Oh, now I'm nervous. Now I'm going to choke. So when we set out to do the Pocket Park, it was a project, it was a student project, but the real idea was to create revenue stream. It was really to create a business. And for 315 years, Detroit has been a place where people found themselves congregating in order to create a revenue stream and find a place to live and flourish. So the project was a surrogate, and the learning was to find out what some of the issues are, and then it's sort of teaching the person how to fish. You can create your own business doing these things, and they will propagate and solve problems going down the road. So it's the impact that it has that's important.
Any more questions? Haj. Yeah.
All right, my question is for Carl. I love this facility, and my question to you is, how does this facility's, or what is this facility's role in terms of creating this new Detroit, or being a creative hub in the center of Detroit?
That's it? Well, Haj is also part of this too. And maybe it's a nice way to end the discussion tonight or bring all of these things together. It's certainly what you see first and foremost is Lawrence Tech with a space in Detroit. And that's an important thing, to be part of a neighborhood, to be able to pull a lot of different groups together. We do see it as a space, the way that Lillian described the project that she's taking on next semester and trying to build opportunities for students to engage within the city. There's also the problem that we have that young designers aren't always staying in Michigan. And so to be able to have the DCDT here allows our students to see that there is a vibrancy in the city. There are incredible opportunities for young designers in the city. And so this is also an important mission for the space that we're sitting in right now. And so I think that's where you'll see these things going and heading. There's opportunities both from a technological standpoint as we bring people in and we work with people, the work that you're doing to develop 100 websites for local businesses in Detroit. That's also a really amazing model for young designers to be looking at. So I think it's a way for us to be engaged. It's a way for us to I mean, we're sitting right on Woodward right now to be part of the city. And I imagine these types of events and these types of projects to continue to develop in the coming years. It's an amazing place to be working and collaborating. Do you guys you have anything to close with?
Closing thoughts. Are we going to do it in order? Okay, so let's see. Closing thoughts. What I will say is there's a number of both universities and other projects from all over the world that are thinking about how they land in Detroit. And thinking about how they set up workshops and how they set up facilities and how they sort of create exchanges. And I think that the thing that could be really interesting is to be able to do it with a certain amount of transparency around what you can and can't do, what you are good at, what roles you can and can't play. And I think the thing that I saw in all of the work was a kind of frankness. And I thought that was a good way of kind of approaching this. This is take it as it is on some level. And that was appreciated.
And we went back and forth on that topic, and I don't know that we quite landed on one way or another, but whether or not that was a criticism, that in some ways is the work is very grounded, but could there be broader visions that are possible with the work? Could we take more risks with the work? Could we start to open these things up?
It's a good hello. So so did anybody attend the design summit that happened? Okay, so at one point in time, there was a series of kind of design competitions, whatever, that happened as part of the two-day summit. And one of the projects was just kind of acknowledging the fact that when people come into town, they don't often say, hello, I'm here. They don't kind of just say, hi, I'm here, and who are you, and what are you doing? And I would say that this is a good hi. This is a good hello, my name is. Yes, as you go forward, it's going to get bigger and more ambitious, but your relationship will grow, and you can sort of take more flights of fancy as relationships grow, I guess.
So I don't know if this is allowed. It was a closing remark and you prompted a question. Maybe that's a good thing. Maybe we should have done the closing remarks first.
This is like faculty meetings.
Well, when you talk about the hello, like this being a good hello and there being a frankness to the work, I like my colleagues back here, we're taking that as both a critique and a compliment. And in a field where we routinely give our design services away in the ambitions of a provocation or competition, and thus value our contributions, right? Because we're giving them away for free. Where in the world of science, publishing peer-reviewed research, things that are intended to be tested and then disproven so that we can build knowledge and move steadily forward. In a place like Detroit, where we're asking really thorny, complex questions, especially in semestered nuggets, like you see on the wall here often, should we not be moving to a place of frankness and measuredness, sharing work routinely for the sole purpose of being disproven? And if so, what are the formats that might take? Because in the world of science, I know where to point, right? But it seems in the world of architecture that we've adopted a very different mindset about how precedents are studied and used and how case studies are studied and used, right? This seems like a fundamental shift.
Well, I'll say I think what's exciting about this space is I think it opens up a new avenue for testing ideas and putting things out there. I mean, I think a lot of the design, especially the planning work that makes it to the public's eye in the city is filtered through a lot of really well-worn channels. It's funded by the planning department or foundations, and that's really good, except it has to be, I think for it to filter through those channels, it needs to be safe in some ways, and I'll say that. I think it needs to be safe and not whimsical for the most part, and I think this here on Woodward opens up a type of work that's maybe very familiar to us within the academy, but is not that familiar to a lot of other people.
I have to disagree. No, I mean, so yes, okay, the process of going through these filters are only ever going to be as good as the person who's commissioning the work, and it's only ever going to be as thoughtful as the person who's organizing the calls and the briefs for these works. But I will say that if you can be in the North End and visit a mothership on any given night, that's not a bad job, and those have routinely attracted major grants, and so I think we have to sort of recalibrate who we think of as the buyers of our work, right, and the supporters of our work and the champions of our work, because I've seen a number of funders, whether it's the national funders who are playing a big role in kind of the city, really incentivize individual creative practitioners. I mean, we are one of a handful of cities where you don't have to be a 501c3 in order to receive an award to do a place-based project.
But just to follow that example,
Yeah.
Mothership didn't start with a Knight grant. That work has a lineage that began
Of course.
in a place just like this.
Of course.
So I think there is a relationship between things that are sort of experimented and pushed out there and then things that
Yeah.
eventually feel, it's not meant to be a critique of
No.
the foundations or
No, I mean, there's plenty you can critique the foundations for. So I'm not sitting here saying that they're kind of hallowed, but that there is adventurous work that is taking place by the people who are funding that work, and that the funding in and of itself doesn't produce beige doll work in and of itself. There can be interesting work that is funded.
Do you want the last word, Lillian?
Well, I'll take you off the hook. What I was going to say, and I think I was not following Scott's comment, but preceding and then following Scott's comment. And on the big hello, as I'm sitting here and looking out this window at this amazing full moon, and this window is a skin between us and them, or that connects us and them. I see couples walking by with $600, I'm assuming, mohair suits, and then I also see people walking down there with the baskets and hand-me-downs, hand-me-downs, and hand-me-downs. So how is this big hello? Here's the question. How are we at Lawrence Tech, and I don't know if any of this work addresses that, how do we mediate that? How do we bridge that gap, if I may?
I think also what's interesting with your question is that none, or I would assume none of the work that we see here tonight was burdened at its inception with the fact that it was going to be publicly displayed in the context of Detroit or as a hello. And so that's, I think, both an interesting thing and we've talked a lot about different types of responsibilities or pressures that come with work, and I think had the work been conceived of with that pressure, it would have probably been a very different and maybe even more safe than what we're seeing here tonight.
I think one of the exciting things about the program that you're introducing, if I understand it correctly, I think something that gets people who aren't necessarily designers to attend things like this is when there's something they know and that they know as part of the exhibition. So if it's their neighborhood or a project where they were asked what they thought or there's some kind of engagement, I think, that's good to find out what people think, right? But I think as a way to just start, I think using the opportunity to invite people and bring people and motivate people into the space, and then use that as an opportunity not just to do the job, whatever the job is, and get paid for it, but also maybe push past that and use projects as opportunities to, I think, project a little bit more than maybe foundations are comfortable with.
You'd be surprised what they're comfortable with. No,
I think that's one
Yeah.
one way to do that.
So it becomes more of a community space in that sense.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, I think that we talked about this when we talked about some of the engagement work, is that at some point in time, this dialogue has to be the kind of dialogue we're having with the beneficiaries of these projects in the room, so that we're not having this in isolation. So I think to sort of ask the question again is like, what do we mean by peer reviewed? Like, who are our peers when this is the work that we're talking about? Because there's our disciplinary peers, there's our community of practice, but then I think that there's this other hello, which is about reaching out to a community of interest. And those are going to be stakeholders that cross everything from the citizen to the policymaker to the other, the working professional or some of the other actors in the city. And I think this space acting in that way becomes a really interesting provocation, like where you could find yourself having all of those kind of actors kind of cross-pollinating more. And I think that's really when I think you start seeing the projects, from my point of view, that are allowed and emboldened to take risks. It's really hard to take risks if you're feeling like it's only coming from your discipline and only supported by your disciplinary community. But when you feel like you've got like lots of people at your back, I think you can be emboldened to take risks. It doesn't always have to equal like dumbing down or being safe.
Maybe that's an even better answer to Haj's question. Being able to bring experts into a space like this and to have our students develop an ability to speak with people outside of their own disciplines in order to be able to produce what might be more evocative or speculative work. I want to thank Lawrence Technological University, Hudson Weber, even e-learning for broadcasting this tonight and doing all the recording for us. I want to thank the faculty whose work is here, the faculty who've led student work that's here. I want to thank the students who submitted work and alumni that submitted work. I believe we still have more wine and cheese, and I would welcome everyone to wander around, look at the work. I think in our next call, we'll do a much better job about specifying where people's names and a short description will be. And this is something that needs to end up on the work. Right now, it's, you can't always tell whose work is where, which is both interesting, but I think it's also a little problematic when it comes to credits. But I want to take the time to also thank the panel for joining us tonight. So thank you, everybody.